A cold, unyielding darkness blanketed the narrow cell, and in that oppressive silence, David sat on the rough wooden bunk, every minute stretching into an eternity. The walls, stained with years of neglect and sorrow, enclosed him like the arms of a relentless fate. His mind churned with conflicting thoughts, memories of a life that once held promise and the bitter taste of betrayal that had led him here. In that moment, the only sound was the steady drip of water from a leaky pipe, punctuating the silence like a taunt. David's eyes, adjusting slowly to the dim light that seeped through a tiny, barred window high on the wall, darted around the cell. Shadows danced on the cold concrete floor, each flicker igniting fleeting moments of hope and despair. Though his body was physically confined, his thoughts soared, searching for answers in a maze of injustice and regret. He had been told that his fate was sealed, that a man's lies, crafted by those meant to protect the public, could ruin a life. And here he was, a man wrongfully imprisoned, his innocence buried beneath layers of deception. A deep, resonant knock shattered the stillness. It came suddenly and without warning, echoing off the cell walls with a power that made David's heart pound in his chest. His breath caught, and his eyes widened in anticipation. Every instinct screamed that this was no ordinary interruption. For years in this forsaken place, the knock of a door had rarely meant anything good. But tonight, something was different, a promise of change, or perhaps another cruel twist of fate. The knock came again, deliberate and measured, as if someone on the other side of the heavy metal door was testing both the lock and David's resolve. With a mixture of trepidation and a flicker of hope, David slowly rose from the bunk. His legs, though weakened by the harsh conditions of prison life, carried him forward. He approached the door, his every step echoing on the cold, concrete floor. The sound of his own footsteps was a reminder of the solitude that had become his constant companion. As he reached out to touch the cold, rusted handle, a rush of emotions flooded him. The door had always been a barrier, a symbol of separation from the world outside, from justice, from redemption. Tonight, however, it seemed to beckon him, urging him to listen, to understand. He hesitated, his mind torn between the desire for answers and the fear of what might come next. The knock repeated, louder and more insistent now, almost as if the voice on the other side was desperate to be heard. David's pulse quickened. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, trying to steady his racing heart and recall fragments of memories from before his incarceration. He remembered long days filled with laughter, a family that once embraced him with warmth, and the promise of a future that had been abruptly snatched away. But those memories were now distant echoes, drowned out by the harsh reality of the present. In that fragile moment, as David reached out and slowly turned the handle, the door creaked open to reveal a sliver of light from the corridor beyond. The beam of light cut through the darkness like a knife, and for an instant, he caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow flitting across the wall, too swift to be clearly seen. The figure lingered at the threshold, cloaked in mystery, leaving David with a sense of foreboding. Who was this stranger that had dared to disturb his isolation? And why now, after so many years of silence? The corridor beyond the cell was dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights that hummed with an erratic energy. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something else, an odor that David could not quite place, something that hinted at secrets hidden in the depths of the prison. The figure in the doorway did not speak, nor did they step fully into the cell. Instead, they remained half in shadow, half in light, as if caught between two worlds. David's eyes searched the figure's face, trying to decipher any sign of recognition or intent, but the stranger's features were obscured by a worn cap and a dark jacket that swallowed any details. For several long seconds, neither spoke. The silence was heavy with unasked questions and unspoken truths. David's mind raced. Could this be an ally, someone who had come to reveal the corruption that had ensnared him? Or was it yet another twist in a game he had never wished to play? His heart pounded in his ears as he finally mustered the courage to speak. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. The figure remained silent for a moment, as if weighing the weight of the question. Then, in a voice that was soft yet edged with urgency, the stranger replied, "I'm here to tell you that everything you've been told is a lie." Those words, simple and direct, reverberated through David's soul, stirring a blend of hope and dread within him. For years, he had clung to the possibility that his story might be more than a tale of injustice, that there might be someone out there who believed in his innocence, someone who could help him find the truth. The stranger's words were brief, almost dismissive of the gravity of the situation, yet they carried an undeniable weight. "Everything you've been told is a lie." In that moment, the air in the cell seemed to shift, as if the very foundations of the prison were trembling with the promise of revelation. David's mind whirled with questions. Who was this person? How did they know about his wrongful imprisonment? And, most importantly, what was the truth that lay hidden beneath the layers of deception? Before David could ask another question, the light from the corridor flickered ominously, casting distorted shadows that danced along the walls. The stranger took a small step back, their figure merging with the darkness beyond the cell. "I cannot stay," the voice continued, tinged with regret and urgency. Unable to shake the intensity of the moment, David began to pace the small confines of his cell. His footsteps, soft yet insistent on the worn concrete, marked the passage of time as he replayed the encounter over and over in his mind. Every detail, the sound of the knock, the flash of the stranger's face, and the final, haunting words, was etched into his memory. It was as if that brief meeting had been orchestrated to awaken something dormant within him, a resolve that had long been buried under the weight of injustice. He paused before the tiny window, peering out at a sliver of the night sky. The stars, though faint, shone like distant beacons of hope against the black canvas of space. In that fleeting moment of connection with the outside world, David allowed himself to dream, even if only for a few precious seconds. He imagined a life where truth prevailed, where the lies that had condemned him would crumble under the weight of undeniable evidence. But such dreams were fragile, as delicate as the light that filtered through the bars of his window. A sudden noise from the corridor pulled him back to the present, a soft shuffle, the scuff of shoes against concrete. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be another visitor? Or perhaps a guard on routine patrol? The uncertainty gnawed at him, intensifying the tension that already coiled in his chest. David's senses were on high alert. Every sound, every creak of the ancient building, seemed to whisper secrets he could almost grasp yet could not fully comprehend. The minutes stretched on, each one heavy with the possibility of change. David's mind raced with plans and questions. Should he wait for another sign? Was there a way to signal back, to let this mysterious benefactor know that he was ready to learn the truth? His thoughts turned to the few scraps of information he had gathered during his time in prison, whispers among inmates, hushed conversations in the corridors, and the furtive glances exchanged in moments of unexpected solidarity. All these fragments hinted at a larger story, one that extended far beyond the cold confines of his cell. In the stillness that followed, a low murmur arose from somewhere beyond the immediate vicinity of his cell. It was difficult to tell whether it was the sound of footsteps or the rustle of fabric in the wind that seeped through the old, drafty corridors. The sound was almost musical in its cadence, a rhythmic pulse that resonated with the beating of his heart. David felt a strange compulsion to follow that sound, as if it were guiding him toward answers he had long sought. With a deep, steadying breath, he approached the cell door once more. This time, rather than hesitating, he gently pushed it open just a crack, peering out into the dim corridor. The light was weak, and the shadows seemed to merge and separate with each flicker of the failing bulbs. In that narrow sliver of space, he caught sight of a familiar symbol etched faintly into the wall, a barely noticeable mark that had, on previous occasions, signified a clandestine network among the prisoners. The mark was a silent message, a sign that there were others who believed in truth and justice, even within these oppressive walls. David's heart leaped. Was this a coincidence, or had the mysterious stranger been part of that network? The thought sent a shiver down his spine and stirred a newfound determination within him. He knew that every moment was precious. The darkness that had once swallowed him whole now held the promise of a revelation that could alter the course of his life forever. Just as he began to plan his next move, the corridor's shadows shifted once more. A figure emerged from the depths of the passage, a guard, perhaps, or someone else entirely. The figure's face was obscured by a cap and a uniform that did little to hide the authoritative posture they carried. David froze, his heart pounding so loudly he feared the sound might betray him. The guard's eyes, cold and unyielding, swept over the corridor. For a moment, it seemed as though the guard's gaze locked with David's, a silent interrogation passing between them. Time slowed as the guard stepped closer, and David's mind raced with thoughts of what might come next. Had he been discovered? Was this guard in on the secret, or simply an agent of the very system that had condemned him? The air thickened with tension, and every second felt like an eternity. Then, as suddenly as the confrontation began, the guard paused, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he turned and continued down the corridor, leaving David to wonder whether the encounter was mere coincidence or an intentional diversion. With the guard's departure, the corridor fell silent once more. David exhaled slowly, his body trembling with the intensity of the moment. He closed the cell door quietly behind him and leaned against it, his mind racing with the possibilities that now lay before him. The brief appearance of the mysterious stranger, the secret mark on the wall, and the unsettling encounter with the guard, all these signs converged to create a tapestry of clues, each one pointing toward a hidden truth waiting to be uncovered. In that charged silence, David made a silent vow to himself. Whatever lay ahead, he would no longer remain a passive victim of circumstances. The injustice that had brought him here could no longer define him. The promise of truth and the possibility of redemption, however faint, stirred a fire within him that he had long thought extinguished. He would seize every opportunity, every whispered secret, and every hidden clue to reclaim the life that had been stolen from him. As the minutes turned into an hour, David retreated back into the confines of his cell. He sat on the bunk once again, his mind a flurry of plans and recollections. The stranger's parting words, "Your innocence is not lost, and the key to your freedom lies in what you do next," resonated deeply within him. They were a call to action, a challenge to rise above the oppressive despair and to fight for the truth. Yet, that challenge came with a heavy burden. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and betrayal, but it was also illuminated by the potential for a just resolution. In the soft glow of the waning night, David allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He thought of the life he once led, the warmth of friendships, the gentle embrace of his family, and the dreams he had cherished. Those memories were both a source of comfort and a painful reminder of all that he had lost. But they also provided a glimpse of what might still be recovered, a future where truth prevailed over deception and where the human spirit triumphed even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Just as David's thoughts began to settle into a fragile determination, another sound reached his ears, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper from somewhere deep in the corridors of the prison. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking, sharing secrets of long-forgotten rebellions and clandestine alliances. The sound, subtle yet insistent, stirred something within him. It was a reminder that even in the darkest places, there was life, there was resistance, and there was hope. With renewed resolve, David rose from his bunk once more. His eyes, now clearer with determination, scanned the cell for anything that might serve as a clue or a tool for his next move. Every scrap of paper, every dent in the wall, every mark on the floor was a potential piece of the puzzle, a puzzle that, when solved, might reveal the truth behind his wrongful imprisonment. He traced his fingers along the rough surface of the wall, feeling for any hidden indentations or carvings that might hold significance. In that small, isolated cell, every detail mattered. The knock of that earlier moment, the mysterious figure's parting words, and the secret mark on the corridor wall coalesced in David's mind into a single, burning question: what would he do next? The answer was not clear yet, but it was beginning to form, a plan that would require courage, cunning, and an unyielding belief in the possibility of redemption. The truth, elusive as it was, beckoned him from the shadows, promising that his fight for justice was far from over. As the distant sounds of the prison settled into a quiet murmur, David took one last long look at the small window. Beyond those iron bars lay a world that had moved on without him, yet still held the keys to his future. With a final, determined sigh, he whispered to himself, "I will find the truth, no matter what it takes." In that moment, the cell was no longer just a prison, it had transformed into a battleground, a place where the seeds of hope and resistance were sown in the harsh soil of injustice. And so, as the night deepened and the shadows lengthened, David prepared himself for the unknown. Outside his cell, in the labyrinthine corridors of the prison, secrets lay waiting to be discovered. Each step he took from this moment onward would be a step toward reclaiming his life and unmasking the lies that had bound him for so long. The journey was just beginning, and though the road ahead promised danger and uncertainty, David's spirit burned bright with the determination to see justice done. In that unforgiving moment, as the cold walls of the prison bore silent witness to his resolve, David's fate was sealed not by the lies that had condemned him but by the strength he now summoned from within. The call to action had been sounded, and the battle for truth was about to begin. With every beat of his heart, he embraced the challenge, aware that the coming hours and days would test every fiber of his being. And as the corridor fell into silence once more, one undeniable truth emerged from the darkness: the fight for redemption had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. The cold silence of the prison cell was broken only by the muted echoes of distant footsteps and hushed murmurs of other inmates. David sat on the edge of his bunk, the memory of the mysterious visitor from the previous night still vivid in his mind. That brief encounter had left him with more questions than answers, a burning need to know what lay hidden behind the official narrative of his wrongful conviction. Now, in the dim light of early morning, as the oppressive darkness of the cell began to yield to the weak light seeping through barred windows, the seeds of doubt began to sprout in the depths of his mind. A flicker of the past. David's thoughts wandered back to the days before the incarceration, a time when life had been filled with simple joys and uncomplicated truths. He remembered the soft laughter of his children echoing in the warm kitchen on lazy Sunday mornings, the gentle touch of his wife's hand as they walked side by side in the park, and the pride that swelled in his chest every time he returned home from work. Those were the days of honest labor and shared dreams, days that now seemed like a distant, almost unreal memory. Yet, as the recollections surfaced, they carried with them hints of a darker undercurrent. There was the day when a knock at the door came not with a greeting, but with the cold shock of betrayal. David recalled the stern face of a man in uniform, whose words were laced with accusation. The memory of that confrontation was seared into his mind, the officer's eyes, cold and unyielding, and the way he had declared David guilty without a shred of evidence. The injustice of that day had set in motion the chain of events that led to David's imprisonment. Even now, the details of that fateful encounter stirred feelings of anger and disbelief. In the quiet moments of introspection, David began to piece together the fragments of his past. He recalled subtle inconsistencies that he had noticed even then, though at the time they seemed trivial. The officer had given conflicting accounts of the incident, one moment claiming that David was at the scene of a violent altercation, and the next insisting he was merely in the wrong place at the wrong time. These discrepancies had been brushed aside by a system eager to seal his fate, but now they took on a new significance. They were the first hints that perhaps the truth had been manipulated, twisted into a narrative that served the interests of those in power. A tense exchange. Later that morning, as the prison began to stir with the routine clamor of daily life, David found himself in the common area, a cramped, dimly lit room where inmates gathered in small clusters to share whispers of their own stories. It was here that he encountered Marcus, a grizzled man whose eyes had seen too many injustices. Marcus had been in the prison for years, and his quiet, measured manner concealed a wealth of knowledge about the inner workings of the system. Sitting on a battered cot in a corner, Marcus was engaged in a hushed conversation with another inmate. David approached cautiously, his curiosity piqued by the way Marcus's words seemed to hint at hidden truths. "Marcus," David began softly, "do you ever wonder about the way things are explained to us? About the versions of events that they hand out like unchangeable truths?" Marcus's gaze shifted slowly toward David, and for a long moment, the silence between them was heavy with unspoken understanding. "Everything has a story, David," he said in a gravelly tone. "But sometimes, the stories we're told aren't the stories that truly happened." His eyes narrowed as he continued, "There are inconsistencies, small details that don't quite add up if you look closely." Encouraged by Marcus's words, David pressed on, recounting his own memory of the day he was arrested. He recalled the officer's shifting accounts and the dismissive way in which his pleas of innocence were silenced by the roar of a system convinced of his guilt. "I remember that day," David said quietly. "The officer's eyes held a certainty that made me question my own recollections. He said one thing, then another, as if he had rehearsed multiple versions of the truth." Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I've seen it happen before. The ones who are in power, they craft the narrative, piece by piece, until it fits their purpose. And if you look hard enough, you might find a crack in the facade." His words resonated with David, planting the seed of doubt that would soon grow into a determination to uncover the truth. The underground network. In the days that followed, whispers of an underground network began to circulate among the inmates. David had overheard fragments of conversation that hinted at secret meetings, hidden messages etched on the walls, and a quiet resistance that fought against the corruption festering within the prison. One evening, as David sat alone in his cell, a soft rustling sound reached his ears, a sound distinct from the usual creaks and groans of the old building. It was as if someone had taken the time to leave behind a deliberate mark, a sign that there was more to his story than the official records suggested. Investigating the sound, David discovered a small piece of paper tucked behind a loose brick in the wall. The note was brief, written in a hurried scrawl: "Truth lies in the shadows. Look beyond the obvious." The message was cryptic, yet it stirred a sense of hope in him, a feeling that he was not alone in his quest for answers. This note, combined with Marcus's subtle hints and the growing unease about the officer's contradictory statements, convinced David that there was a deeper conspiracy at work. Over the next few days, David began to pay closer attention to the conversations around him. In the common areas and even during the routine headcounts, he listened for fragments of dialogue that might reveal more about the hidden network. Slowly, he pieced together a mosaic of information, a coded language of glances, whispered words, and discrete symbols painted in faded chalk on the walls. It became increasingly apparent that the corruption was not confined to the case that had imprisoned him alone, it was part of a much larger system of deceit that had ensnared many lives. One late evening, as the prison settled into a rare calm, David found himself in the company of a younger inmate named Julian. Julian was a quiet, introspective man who had suffered his own share of misfortune, and over time, he had become a trusted confidant among those who sought the truth. In the half-light of the rec room, the two men talked in low voices, sharing details of their experiences with the authorities. "Have you ever noticed," Julian whispered, "that the more you question what you're told, the more they try to silence you?" His eyes darted around, ensuring no guard was within earshot. "I overheard two guards talking earlier about a file that might contain evidence of what really happened on the day of the incident. They said it was hidden in a place no one would ever think to look." David felt a surge of adrenaline as he absorbed Julian's words. The idea that there might be tangible evidence to contradict the official story was exhilarating. "Where do they say it is?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Julian hesitated before replying, "I can't say for sure, but there's a rumor about a storage room behind the administrative block, a place where records are kept, far from prying eyes. They say it's guarded by more than just locks and keys. The corruption runs deep, and if you want to find the truth, you'll have to be careful." The conversation left David both hopeful and wary. The possibility of a file or document that could exonerate him was a dream he had clung to in the darkest hours. Yet, the danger was palpable. The guards were known to be ruthless in maintaining the status quo, and any attempt to retrieve such evidence would not go unnoticed. The growing chasm of doubt. As the days turned into weeks, David's internal struggle intensified. The more he recalled his past, the laughter of his children, the comfort of a loving home, the more he felt the weight of the injustice he had suffered. Each flashback was a reminder of what had been stolen from him, and every inconsistency in the officer's account deepened his conviction that he was a victim of a calculated betrayal. One particular evening, as a storm raged outside the prison walls, David found himself alone in the rec room. The thunder outside mirrored the tumult inside him. His mind drifted to the trial, a day that had been marked by chaos and confusion. The storm outside provided a fitting backdrop for his inner turmoil. Rain hammered against the small window, each drop a reminder of the tears shed in moments of despair. In that raw and vulnerable moment, David resolved that he would no longer be a passive recipient of the narrative forced upon him. He would become a seeker of truth, a man determined to uncover the hidden threads that tied his fate to a much larger conspiracy. With renewed purpose, David began to document every detail he could recall about the day of his arrest. He meticulously noted the inconsistencies in the officer's statements, the sequence of events as he remembered them, and even the smallest nuances, the tone of voice, the body language, the way the officer's eyes shifted when confronted with his own recollections. Each detail was a piece of a puzzle that he was slowly beginning to assemble. During one of these long, sleepless nights, David sat at the small, rickety desk in his cell, scribbling furiously in a notebook he had managed to acquire through discreet channels. The pages filled with his recollections and the insights of those around him, forming a tapestry of suspicion and determination. He knew that every word he wrote was an act of defiance against the injustice that had confined him. Even as he penned down his doubts, he felt an underlying certainty that somewhere within those jotted lines lay the key to his freedom. A chance encounter. The turning point came unexpectedly one afternoon. David was making his routine rounds in the common area when he noticed a familiar figure lingering near a group of inmates. It was the same mysterious individual who had visited him in the cell not long ago, a person whose presence was always brief but charged with significance. The stranger's eyes met David's for a fleeting moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. In that instant, David felt an inexplicable assurance that the hidden network was watching, guiding him toward the truth. Later that day, during a moment of relative quiet, a guard's hushed conversation caught David's attention as he walked past a secluded corridor. The guard, unaware of David's proximity, was speaking on a secure radio, discussing a file that had recently been moved. Phrases like deep cover, hidden evidence, and corruption goes all the way punctuated the conversation. Although the details were murky, the implication was clear. The injustice was not an isolated incident, but part of a systemic rot that extended far beyond David's case. David's heart pounded as he absorbed the overheard words. Here was tangible proof, however slight, that there was more to his story than a simple case of mistaken identity. The file, if it existed, could potentially dismantle the false narrative that had condemned him. The possibility ignited a fierce hope within him, a desire to dig deeper into the murky underbelly of the prison's secrets. Building the case. In the days that followed, David dedicated himself to gathering every scrap of information he could find. With Marcus's guidance and Julian's careful tips, he mapped out a mental blueprint of the prison's administrative layout, the shifting patterns of the guards, and the hidden recesses where information might be stashed away. The network, though secretive and cautious, slowly revealed itself through subtle acts of defiance, a shared look here, a coded message there, and the quiet camaraderie among those who dared to believe in something beyond the official narrative. Every conversation became an opportunity to learn more, every whispered word a potential clue. David spent hours in quiet corners of the common area, his eyes constantly scanning for the smallest sign that could confirm his suspicions. His notebook grew thicker with each passing day, filled with meticulous details and tentative theories. It was a record of not just his own memories, but of a collective longing for justice that resonated among the inmates. Late one night, while the prison was shrouded in an uneasy quiet, David was approached by a fellow inmate known only as Ravi. Ravi was known for his cautious demeanor and was respected for his ability to navigate the dangerous currents of prison politics. In a hushed tone, Ravi confided, "There's talk among us that the file you've heard about isn't just any document. It's said to contain evidence that ties our wrongful convictions to higher authorities, evidence that could topple the entire system of corruption." David's pulse quickened. "How do you know this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ravi's eyes darted around before he continued, "I've seen it with my own eyes, a man in a dark suit, someone who shouldn't be here, passing along documents in a secret room behind the admin office. I couldn't see much, but what I did see made my blood run cold." Ravi paused, the gravity of his revelation hanging heavy in the air. "They're not just covering up one case. They're erasing the truth for many of us." That night, as David lay awake on his cot, the pieces began to fall into place. The flashbacks of his past, the subtle discrepancies in the officer's account, the cryptic note, and the overheard guard conversation all converged into a single, undeniable truth: his wrongful imprisonment was part of a larger, meticulously orchestrated scheme. The realization was both terrifying and galvanizing. He was no longer just a victim of a single injustice, he was caught in the web of a sprawling conspiracy that reached far beyond the prison walls. The burgeoning resolve. With this newfound understanding, the seeds of doubt had taken root and were beginning to blossom into a resolute determination. David resolved that he would no longer let the lies of those in power dictate his fate. The evidence, if it could be found and properly verified, would not only exonerate him but also expose a far-reaching corruption that had undermined the very foundations of justice. Every interaction, every whispered conversation, and every small clue now served a higher purpose. David was determined to follow the trail, no matter how dangerous or uncertain the path might be. In his quiet moments, he revisited the memory of the mysterious visitor from his cell, a figure whose brief words had set him on this quest for truth. That enigmatic message, "Truth lies in the shadows. Look beyond the obvious," echoed in his mind with renewed clarity. Armed with his notes, the fragmented pieces of overheard conversations, and the shared knowledge of his fellow inmates, David began to formulate a plan. He would try to access the administrative areas of the prison, not by force, but through the network of allies that had quietly emerged in the shadows. Every day brought him closer to the possibility of finding the file, an elusive piece of evidence that might dismantle the carefully constructed narrative of his guilt. A cliffhanger of revelation. On a particularly drizzly afternoon, as gray clouds hung low over the prison yard, David found himself once again in the common area, deep in thought. The chill in the air was mirrored by the chill running down his spine as he recalled the guard's conversation from days before. The promise of the hidden file, and the damning evidence it could provide, filled him with both hope and trepidation. Just then, a new development unfolded. A guard, whose voice was low and cautious, passed by David's table carrying a sealed envelope. David's eyes locked onto the envelope for a moment. The guard's furtive glance in David's direction suggested that this was no ordinary delivery. Was it possible that this envelope contained the very document that Ravi had hinted at? The possibility ignited a spark of adrenaline, but before David could act on it, the guard hurried away, leaving him with nothing more than the lingering question and a mounting sense of urgency. David's heart pounded as he clutched his notebook, its pages filled with the seeds of doubt that now had the potential to grow into undeniable evidence. The weight of the conspiracy pressed down on him, but so did the hope of exoneration. He knew that every step he took from this point on would be fraught with danger. Yet, the prospect of uncovering the truth, of dismantling the edifice of lies that had imprisoned him, was worth any risk. As dusk fell over the prison, painting the walls in deep shadows, David retreated to the relative safety of his cell. There, amidst the silence and solitude, he resolved to decipher every clue, every whispered hint, and every coded message that had come his way. The investigation had become a personal crusade, a battle against the pervasive corruption that had not only stolen his freedom but had also tainted the lives of many others. With a final look at the fading light through his small window, David whispered to himself, "I will find the truth." In that solemn vow lay the unyielding determination of a man who had been wronged, a man who was now willing to risk everything to reclaim his life and restore justice. His journey into the labyrinth of deception had only just begun, and each new revelation brought him closer to a truth that was as elusive as it was transformative. As the night deepened and the prison settled into a restless quiet, the seeds of doubt sown in David's mind promised to sprout into something far greater, a movement, a spark of rebellion against a system that thrived on deceit. And though the road ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, one thing was clear: the deeper David dug, the more he would uncover, and the more the facade of justice would begin to crumble. David's mind raced through the details of every conversation, every overheard snippet, every stray piece of evidence he had gathered over the past few weeks. The storm of injustice and betrayal that had long confined him now fueled a burning determination to reclaim not only his freedom, but also the truth that lay hidden beneath layers of corruption. As he sat in the dim light of his cell one cold, restless night, he began to formulate a plan, a daring, calculated move that would challenge the very foundation of the corrupt system that had sentenced him to this life. The spark of resolve. The memory of the mysterious visitor's parting words, "Your innocence is not lost, and the key to your freedom lies in what you do next," echoed in David's mind as he meticulously reviewed every detail he had noted. His notebook, filled with scribbled observations and coded messages from fellow inmates, lay open on the small, rickety desk. The pages were dense with recollections, the conflicting accounts given by the officer on that fateful day, the cryptic note tucked behind a loose brick, and the overheard conversation between guards hinting at the existence of a hidden file. Each fragment of information was a puzzle piece, and David was determined to assemble the entire picture. He recalled the hushed conversation with Marcus in the common area. Marcus's gravelly voice had resonated with hard-won wisdom as he had said, "Sometimes, the ones in power shape the story until it fits their purpose. Look for the cracks, David, and you might find something real." Those words had lit a spark within him, a spark that now blazed with the intensity of a man who refused to accept the narrative forced upon him. David realized that his plan had to be twofold. First, he needed to gather undeniable evidence from the prison's inner workings, a document or file that could reveal the discrepancies in the official record and tie his wrongful conviction to a broader conspiracy. Second, he had to build alliances among the inmates and even risk enlisting the help of someone on the inside who could navigate the labyrinthine corridors of the administration. Mapping the enemy. Over the next several days, David began to study the prison's layout in painstaking detail. Every shift in the guards' routines, every whispered exchange among inmates, and every obscure corridor became part of his mental blueprint. He observed that the administrative block, a sterile area heavily guarded and seldom frequented by inmates, was rumored to house records that no one was meant to see. It was there, he believed, that the damning file might be hidden. Late one evening, as the other inmates settled into uneasy sleep, David slipped from his cell with the quiet precision of a man who had nothing left to lose. The corridors were dark, lit only by the flickering fluorescent bulbs that cast long, wavering shadows. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the risk he was taking. Yet the promise of justice outweighed the peril. He moved silently, guided by a memory of a map sketched out by a sympathetic guard who had once hinted at secret passages used during old prison riots. The map was rough, drawn in faded ink on a discarded piece of paper, but it offered a glimmer of hope, a possible route that might bypass the more heavily monitored zones. At one point, David paused at a junction where two corridors met. The hush of the night was punctuated only by the distant sound of a guard's footsteps and the low hum of an aging air conditioner. He crouched behind a stack of crates, his senses alert. Every nerve in his body screamed caution, yet the thrill of subverting a system built on lies drove him onward. He knew that this was only the first step of a long and dangerous mission. The file he sought could be the key to unraveling the elaborate web of deceit that had condemned him, but it also meant stepping into a world where one wrong move could cost him everything. Forming an unlikely alliance. The next phase of David's plan involved reaching out to those who had quietly joined him in the quest for the truth. In the common area, his eyes often met those of Julian and Marcus, two inmates whose stories were as interwoven with loss and hope as his own. Julian, the quiet and introspective man with a haunted gaze, had once mentioned in a hushed tone about a storage room behind the administrative block, a place where documents were kept, hidden away from the public eye. Marcus, with his deep lines of experience etched into his weathered face, had repeatedly emphasized that every system had a weakness, a chink in the armor of corruption. One chilly morning, as the first light of dawn crept through the narrow windows of the rec room, David called a discreet meeting with Julian and Marcus. They gathered in a secluded corner where the sounds of routine prison life could not easily reach them. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. "I've mapped out a route," David said quietly, unfolding the faded map and pointing to a series of corridors that led to the administrative block. "I believe there's a hidden file there, evidence that could prove my innocence and expose the lies that led to our suffering." Julian's eyes flickered with cautious optimism. "I overheard guards discussing a secure storage room where records are rarely disturbed," he murmured. "They mentioned it once in passing, but I never thought it meant anything. If that file is there, it could change everything." Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze steady and unyielding. "We must be careful," he warned. "The guards will not tolerate any deviations from the routine. One misstep and we'll have the entire prison on high alert." The three men exchanged determined glances. They knew the stakes were astronomical, but the fire of injustice had ignited a resolve that could not be quenched. Their plan was simple in concept but perilous in execution. While David would attempt to retrieve the file, Marcus and Julian would create a diversion to draw the guards away from the administrative block. The diversion had to be subtle, a disruption in the routine that would not raise alarm bells but enough to cause confusion among the watchful eyes of those in uniform, the daring move. In the following days, the group worked silently, each playing their part. Marcus, using his long tenure in the prison to his advantage, managed to discreetly acquire the uniforms of a low-ranking security officer from an old, discarded locker. With careful precision, he began to study the patterns of the guards, when they took their breaks, when the shifts changed, and when the corridors were at their most deserted. Julian, whose quiet demeanor hid an agile and observant mind, volunteered to help create small disturbances in the routine. He would start minor altercations among a few inmates, enough to force the guards to split their attention. The plan was set for a rainy Thursday evening, when the constant patter of rain against the concrete walls would mask any unusual sounds. That night, under the cloak of darkness, David slipped out of his cell with the map tucked securely under his arm. His pulse pounded as he navigated the labyrinthine corridors, moving closer to the administrative block with every silent step. In a carefully orchestrated series of actions, Marcus and Julian set their plan in motion. Julian initiated a quiet but believable disturbance near the eastern wing, a spot known for its frequent but manageable brawls among a few unruly inmates. The commotion grew steadily, drawing a handful of guards into the area. Meanwhile, Marcus donned the makeshift uniform and wandered near the main administrative corridor, his presence designed to mislead the guards into believing that routine checks were underway in that sector. David reached the corridor leading to the administrative block. The door was heavy, secured with a robust lock that required a key, one that Marcus had managed to obtain through a discreet barter with a sympathetic janitor months ago. His hands trembled as he inserted the key, every second stretching into an eternity. The lock clicked open with an almost mocking finality, and David slipped into the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway beyond. The administrative block was a stark contrast to the grimy, decaying cells that David was used to. Here, the walls were pristine, the floors polished to a dull shine, and the air carried a faint scent of paper and antiseptic. Rows of filing cabinets lined the corridors, each door marked with labels in precise, professional handwriting. David's eyes scanned the area, following the hints provided by Julian's earlier account. He knew that the file he sought was likely hidden in a storage room at the far end of the corridor, a room that was rarely entered and even less frequently checked. As he moved deeper into the block, his every step was accompanied by the echo of his own footsteps, a constant reminder of the risk he was taking. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly before him, the fluorescent lights flickering intermittently as if uncertain of their own purpose. Finally, he arrived at a heavy door marked Record Storage in faded black lettering. Taking a deep breath, David pushed the door open and slipped inside. The room was dimly lit, filled with rows of filing cabinets and dusty shelves that held countless documents. A single window high on the wall allowed a thin shaft of light to pierce the gloom, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the still air. David's eyes darted across the room, searching for anything that might stand out, a file marked with a peculiar symbol, a folder that seemed out of place among the endless sea of records. He moved from cabinet to cabinet, his fingers trailing along the cool metal and rough edges of the file drawers. His heart pounded in his ears as he rifled through the files, each one a potential key to unlocking the truth. Hours seemed to pass as he methodically examined each folder, comparing dates, names, and events. His mind replayed the details he had memorized from his own trial, cross-referencing them with the records in front of him. Then, near the very end of a long row of cabinets, he found it, a thick, manila envelope tucked away in a drawer labeled with an inconspicuous code that he recognized from Marcus's notes. David's hands shook as he carefully pulled the envelope from its hiding place. On the front, in bold, typed letters, were the words, "Confidential, Case Dossier." His breath caught in his throat. Could this be the damning evidence that would expose the fabricated narrative of his guilt? He opened the envelope slowly, as if afraid that the very act might shatter the fragile hope that had carried him this far. Inside, he found a collection of documents, witness statements, internal memos, and even a transcript of a conversation between a high-ranking official and the officer who had falsely implicated him. The documents painted a picture of systematic corruption, a network that manipulated evidence, silenced dissent, and ensured that inconvenient truths were buried beneath layers of deceit. David's eyes scanned the pages feverishly. Every line confirmed his worst suspicions: the system had been rigged, and his fate had been sealed by lies. The price of truth. In that moment of revelation, a surge of adrenaline washed over David. The file was more than just evidence, it was a ticket to exposing the truth and reclaiming his dignity. Yet, as he absorbed the gravity of the discovery, a sudden noise at the door jolted him from his thoughts. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside the storage room. David's heart hammered in his chest as he quickly stuffed the envelope into his bag and crouched behind a filing cabinet. The door creaked open slowly, and for a tense moment, David dared not breathe. A guard entered, his eyes scanning the room methodically. David's mind raced. Had his allies been compromised? Was the diversion working, or had the plan taken an unexpected turn? The guard moved closer, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness as he approached the row of cabinets. David held his breath, every muscle tensed in anticipation of being discovered. After what felt like an eternity, the guard's footsteps receded. The door closed with a quiet click, and silence reclaimed the room. David exhaled shakily and emerged from his hiding place. The file was safe, and the evidence he now held would undoubtedly shatter the carefully constructed narrative that had condemned him. Yet, he also realized that the risk had just escalated. The guard's presence meant that his window of opportunity was rapidly closing. David retraced his steps through the administrative block with the file clutched tightly in his bag. Every step back was laden with the fear of detection. The corridors that had once seemed endless now loomed with a sinister urgency. He navigated the hallways with the practiced caution of a man who had learned to hide in plain sight, slipping into shadowed alcoves whenever footsteps echoed too close. Emerging into a side corridor near the diversion zone set up by Marcus and Julian, David paused to listen. The murmur of voices and the clamor of a staged scuffle filled the air, a calculated distraction meant to keep the guards occupied. With his heart still pounding from the close call, he took a deep breath and began to make his way back toward the area where he could safely return to his cell and rendezvous with his allies. A flicker of uncertainty. As David crept through the corridors, his mind churned with both triumph and trepidation. He had the evidence he needed, a trove of documents that could potentially overturn the miscarriage of justice that had ruined his life. But the discovery also raised new questions. The documents hinted at a deeper conspiracy, one that extended far beyond his individual case. If he could expose this network, the repercussions might unsettle not only his own fate but also the lives of countless others ensnared in the system's web of lies. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. David knew that the moment he stepped back into the common area, he would have to share what he had found with Marcus, Julian, and any others who were part of their quiet resistance. The evidence was both his salvation and a potential catalyst for upheaval, a spark that could ignite a larger movement against the pervasive corruption that had stolen so many lives. Reaching the relative safety of the diversion zone, David paused behind a supply closet to catch his breath. He pulled out the file from his bag, running his fingers over the documents as if to reassure himself of their authenticity. The pages trembled slightly in his grip, each word a testament to the cold, hard reality of the injustice he had endured. Amid the lines of typed text and official stamps, one particular document caught his eye, a transcript of a conversation that blatantly contradicted the narrative given by the officer who had led to his arrest. It was a smoking gun, a direct challenge to the version of events that had been presented in court. The revelation both thrilled and terrified him. David understood that with this evidence, the scales of justice could be tipped in his favor, and perhaps even bring down the corrupt regime that had manipulated so many lives. But he also knew that such a move would not go unnoticed. Powerful forces would mobilize to silence the truth, and he might become a target in a battle that extended far beyond the walls of the prison. The uncertain path forward. With the file clutched tightly in his resolve hardened, David emerged from his hiding place. He moved briskly through the corridor, determined to reach a secure location where he could plan his next move with Marcus and Julian. Each step echoed with the promise of liberation and the risk of imminent danger. The diversion was still in full effect, a chaotic symphony of shouts and clanging metal that masked his cautious retreat. Finally, David reached a small anteroom adjacent to the common area, a space where he knew he could briefly regroup without drawing too much attention. There, huddled in a corner with wary eyes, sat Marcus and Julian. Their expressions shifted from cautious concern to tentative relief as they saw David approach, the gravity of his silence speaking volumes. Without wasting a moment, David spread out the documents on a rickety table. "I found it," he said, his voice low but resolute. "Everything is in here, the discrepancies, the proof that my case isn't an isolated mistake, but part of a larger system of corruption. Listen to this transcript." He handed over a copy of the transcript to Marcus, whose weathered face hardened as he read the words that contradicted the official story. Julian leaned in, his eyes scanning the pages rapidly. This is bigger than we thought," he whispered. "It's not just about you. It's about every case that's been manipulated, every life that's been destroyed by these lies." Marcus nodded slowly. "We have something here that can expose them all," he said, his tone grave. "But we must be extremely cautious. The moment this gets out, the powers that be will move to silence us, and anyone associated with it." David felt a swell of both hope and fear. The file was their most potent weapon, but it was also a beacon that could draw unwanted attention. He took a deep breath and met the eyes of his comrades. "We have to use this evidence to turn the tide," he declared. "I know it's dangerous, but if we can leak this information to someone on the outside, someone who isn't part of the system, we might just force a re-examination of everything." The three men spent the next hours huddled in whispered conversation, planning their next steps. They discussed potential contacts on the outside, sympathetic journalists, legal advocates known for taking on high-profile corruption cases, and even a retired prosecutor who had once hinted at the existence of a covert network within the justice system. Every idea was weighed against the ever-present risk of discovery. They knew that if the authorities caught wind of their plans, the consequences would be dire. As the night deepened, the urgency in the room grew. Outside, the sounds of the staged disturbance gradually subsided as guards regained control of the situation. Inside, the trio recognized that their time was limited. David's heart pounded as he considered the journey ahead, a path fraught with uncertainty, danger, and the potential for monumental change. Before they could finalize their plan to transmit the evidence, a sudden clamor erupted at the door of the anteroom. Voices raised in alarm filtered through the heavy barrier, and the unmistakable sound of heavy boots approaching sent shockwaves of fear through the group. David's pulse raced. The diversion, it seemed, had begun to unravel, and the window for their clandestine meeting was closing. Marcus's eyes widened as he hissed, "We've been compromised. Get the file to a safe place, hide it if you must, while I distract them." Without waiting for further instructions, Marcus stood and moved toward the door, his expression one of grim determination. "Keep talking," he urged David and Julian. "I'll buy you time." David's mind whirled. The risk was now more immediate than ever. "Marcus, don't," he started, but the older man was already stepping into the open, his voice raised in a bold challenge to the approaching guards. The door burst open, and in a flurry of motion, two uniformed guards entered the room. The shock on their faces quickly gave way to stern expressions as they demanded, "What's going on here? Who authorized this meeting?" Marcus met their gaze with an unflinching stare. "I'm just making my rounds," he replied coolly, ensuring that everything is in order. His tone was measured, but his eyes burned with a silent fury that betrayed his true intent. For a tense moment, the guards hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. In that split second, David and Julian seized the opportunity. They quickly gathered the documents and shoved them into a hidden compartment within a battered metal briefcase that Julian had contrived earlier, a safe place for the evidence until they could get it out of the prison entirely. The confrontation escalated quickly. One guard reached for Marcus's arm, but the older man deftly sidestepped and launched into a calculated diversion, a series of rapid, disjointed movements meant to disorient the guards while David and Julian retreated further into the maze of corridors. The sounds of struggle echoed down the hallways, merging with the fading clamor of the earlier diversion. David's heart pounded in his ears as he navigated the narrow passageways with the briefcase clutched tightly against his chest. Every step was fraught with peril, each shadow a potential threat. David's mind raced with the reality of what they were attempting, a covert operation inside a fortress of corruption. The stakes were higher than ever, and the evidence in his hands was a double-edged sword that could both liberate him and paint a target on his back. After what felt like an endless series of tense moments and near misses with patrolling guards, David finally found refuge in a secluded utility corridor. There, in the dim glow of a single, flickering light, he allowed himself a brief moment to catch his breath. The briefcase was secure, and he could almost feel the weight of destiny pressing upon him. He knew that tomorrow, when the prison settled into its routine, they would have to make the next move, transmitting the evidence to an external contact who could verify its authenticity and launch a public inquiry into the corruption that had enslaved them all. As the sound of distant footsteps receded into a heavy silence, David's thoughts turned inward. The file was more than just a collection of documents, it was a declaration of resistance, a tangible challenge to a system built on lies and betrayal. His journey from that cold, oppressive cell to this moment of revelation had been marked by suffering, sacrifice, and an unyielding desire for justice. Now, with the evidence securely in hand and the seeds of rebellion firmly planted, he understood that there was no turning back. In the hush of that dark corridor, David whispered a silent vow to himself and to every soul who had been crushed by the injustice of a rigged system: I will see this through. I will reclaim my truth and expose every lie, no matter the cost. His voice was barely audible, carried away by the stale air, yet it was a promise that resonated deep within him, a promise of hope, of redemption, and of a future where the truth could no longer be buried under the weight of corruption. With that, David gathered his resolve and began to plan the next phase of their dangerous mission. The file was hidden in the briefcase, and a network of allies both inside and outside the prison was slowly coming together. Every piece of evidence they had gathered, every whispered conversation and coded message, was a step toward dismantling the fortress of lies that had imprisoned them all. And while the threat of retribution loomed large, the fire of determination burned brighter than ever in David's heart. As the corridor faded into darkness and the sounds of the night enveloped him, David stepped forward into the unknown. The plan had been set in motion, a plan that would shake the very foundations of the system that had wronged him for so long. The journey was far from over, and the path ahead was treacherous and uncertain. But in that moment, armed with undeniable proof of corruption and fueled by the desire for justice, David was ready to take the risk. The night carried on, and somewhere in the labyrinthine depths of the prison, the echoes of their rebellion resonated, a quiet but insistent call for truth and redemption. And as dawn approached on the horizon, promising a new day, David knew that the unraveling of the system had only just begun. The cool pre-dawn darkness clung to the prison walls as David lay awake on his cot, the briefcase of damning evidence tucked close to his chest. Every minute of the night had been a mixture of adrenaline and deep, disquieting questions. The file he had risked so much to obtain was not just proof of his wrongful conviction, it was a portal into a vast and insidious network of corruption that reached far beyond his personal tragedy. Now, as the first hints of morning light began to seep through the narrow window of his cell, the weight of what he had discovered pressed upon him like an unseen hand. David's mind drifted back over the last few days, the hushed conversations with Marcus and Julian, the meticulous mapping of the prison corridors, and that daring, nerve-wracking escape from the administrative block. He had seen enough to know that the injustice in his case was no isolated error. The file detailed a series of internal memos, altered witness statements, and transcripts of secret conversations that hinted at a coordinated effort to manipulate evidence, and that this manipulation had been used to silence not just him but many others. It was a tapestry of lies, with each thread meticulously woven to keep the truth hidden.